You know, there are nights when the candle flame trembles, as if it knows a secret it would rather not tell you. Nights when the walls of old churches lean in a little closer, pretending they're just listening, when in truth they're eavesdropping, gossiping among themselves about the prayers they've swallowed over the centuries. Tonight is one of those nights, the kind in which miracles stretch their legs like guilty cats, wandering around the nave at hours far too improper for sanctified beings. And so, before the incense settles, before your mind decides whether it wants to sleep or confess, let me whisper to you the oldest question that still embarrasses the heavens. What happens when the divine performs something so strange, so inconvenient, so utterly unmanageable, that even the church prefers to pretend it didn't happen? Ah, yes. Even miracles, apparently, can be politically incorrect. Of course, if you ask any bishop, they will insist that the sacred is as tidy as their theological haircuts. But if you lean close, no, closer, you will hear the hushed rustle of archived miracles hastily hidden behind shelves, as though God himself occasionally misplaces his sense of subtlety. Perhaps he gets bored. Perhaps he experiments. Perhaps he jokes. And perhaps, just perhaps, the celestial bureaucracy is as unorganized as every human institution claiming to represent it. If that thought feels a bit heretical, don't worry. Heresy is merely curiosity wearing the wrong uniform. Tonight's story begins in a town so small, the angels in charge of the area often forgot to update their celestial maps. The kind of place where dust doesn't just settle, it negotiates, where candles burn slower out of sheer boredom, where miracles were supposed to happen in predictable, tasteful doses, not in the wild, sleepless, existentially comedic way they actually did. And yet, here we are. You, reclining in the uncertain posture of someone who meant to fall asleep 10 minutes ago. Me, speaking with the soft, mildly sarcastic tone of a monk who spent too many years copying holy texts, only to discover that marginal commentary is much more fun. And somewhere in between us floats the quiet suspicion that the world is not as logical as we pretend, that faith is not as orderly as the manuals claim, that miracles, miracles, occasionally act like unsupervised children at a solemn banquet. So let me tempt you deeper. Let me open the creaking door to a story the church politely ignored, a story about strange signs, inconvenient wonders, and a protagonist whose name few remember, mostly because the monastery's record-keeper had terrible handwriting. And if you feel a shiver of curiosity, good. That is the holiest sensation of all. But before we go any further, before the shadows on the wall start fidgeting with anticipation, before you settle in pretending this is just background noise, do the holy thing, like the video, and subscribe. Only if you feel called by the algorithmic divine, of course. The digital saints reward engagement. Now, lean closer. Not physically, spiritually, which is far more ergonomic. Imagine a night wrapped not in darkness, but in the dusty velvet of unspoken stories. Candles flickering with the reluctant enthusiasm of overworked saints. A silence so thick it could be served with a spoon. And somewhere inside that silence sits our protagonist, though we will not name him quite yet. Names, after all, carry too much responsibility. Better to meet him the way one meets a shadow, gradually, uncertainly, with a mixture of intrigue and suspicion. His life was simple, almost offensively so. He prayed at the right hours, fasted at the wrong ones, and obeyed every sacred rule with the weary precision of someone who suspects God might be keeping score, but isn't entirely sure which column matters. And yet, for all his obedience, there was something off about him, something not quite aligned with the celestial expectations, something the other monks described as too much thinking for his own good. A dangerous condition indeed. But before we wander into his doubts, before his crisis blossoms like an unintentionally dramatic flower, we must first set the stage. And so let me invite you, gently, ironically, reverently, into the quiet absurdity of his world. A world full of miracles nobody wanted to acknowledge, because acknowledging them would require paperwork. And, between you and me, nothing terrifies religious institutions more than unexpected administrative responsibilities. The first miracle happened in the chapel. Of course it did. It always starts in the chapel, as if God enjoys the architectural acoustics. The candle on the main altar refused to burn downward. Instead, its flame climbed up the wick, defying all known laws of nature, theology, and basic physics. It climbed until it hovered above the candle entirely, a small floating orb of fire, like a sanctified firefly that had lost its sense of direction. The monks panicked, naturally. One ran to fetch holy water. Another ran to fetch regular water in case the holy version was out of warranty. A third fell to his knees in prayer, though later he admitted he had mostly been praying that someone else would handle the situation. Our protagonist simply stared, head tilted, wondering if miracles were supposed to look so unprofessional. Then, without warning, the flame blinked out. No smoke, no smell, nothing. The altar returned to silence, as if embarrassed to have hosted something so disorderly. The monks agreed, immediately, unanimously, with admirable speed, that they had seen nothing, that the candle had merely flickered, that the rising flame had been an illusion, that the floating fireball had been a trick of the light, a hiccup of reality, a shared hallucination possibly caused by bad soup. But our protagonist knew better. He had not only seen it, he had felt it, the warm brush of something divine or deranged passing close enough to singe the edges of his certainty. And that, dear listener, is where the real trouble begins. Because faith may survive storms, but it trembles before inconvenience. The second miracle, also ignored, also inconvenient, happened 3 days later. A stack of ancient manuscripts in the library spontaneously rearranged themselves alphabetically. Every scroll, every brittle page, every forgotten document. Perfect order in a place where order had never dared to exist. The librarian accused the novices. The novices accused the librarian. Both accused the wind, though the windows had been shut tight. When our protagonist suggested that maybe, just maybe, something supernatural had taken an interest in tidying the place, the librarian immediately developed temporary hearing loss. This is, after all, the standard institutional response to divine interference. If God does something weird, pretend you didn't see it. But why? Why refuse to notice? Why sweep miracles under the holy rug? Because nothing frightens us more than the possibility that God is not as predictable as we want him to be. And if you've ever prayed for something and then immediately regretted the chaos of the answer, well, you understand. As for our protagonist, he felt something stirring inside him. A question, a discomfort, a tickle of doubt, like a moth fluttering behind his ribs. He did not yet know what it meant. He only knew that the world was growing stranger, and he, poor, diligent soul, was being chosen or cursed or humorously targeted by the divine. But we're not quite ready for his doubt. Not yet. Tonight, we are merely setting the candle on the table, lighting the wick, and inviting you to sit with the slow-blooming realization that miracles are only comforting when they behave. And these, dear listener, did not behave. You see, the third miracle, the one that truly unsettled the monastery, happened during morning prayers. The chant had begun, low and steady, echoing in the cold stone hall. Monks inhaling incense and exhaling devotion. Everything perfectly timed, perfectly dull, perfectly sacred. Until the hymn began harmonizing with itself. Voices layered over voices, hundreds of them, though only 12 monks were present. The sound rose, celestial, eerie, unnervingly beautiful, and absolutely not authorized. It filled the rafters with voices that had no mouths, no breath, no reason to exist except perhaps divine mischief. The chanting stopped abruptly. Every monk froze. A few turned pale. One fainted, which, to be fair, he did at least twice a month. And then, in a stunning display of collective denial, they decided unanimously that they had heard the wind. Our protagonist, however, felt chills, not just on his skin, on his soul. Something was watching, or listening, or tuning their choir practice without permission. But let me not rush. This is merely the beginning, a whisper compared to what is coming. So breathe slowly. Let the candle flicker across your mind. Let the dust of forgotten miracles settle gently on your thoughts. And remember, this story is not about faith. It is about the absurd, delicious, uncomfortable truth that even the divine has a sense of humor, and that humans, tragically, do not. Now tell me, if you have ever walked into an ancient monastery at dawn, you know the particular kind of cold that waits for you there. Not an aggressive cold, no, nothing dramatic. Just that subtle, polite chill that taps your shoulder like an usher in an old theater, whispering, "Welcome to humility." The stones hold the night long after the sun has risen, as though they, too, prefer darkness. The corridors breathe with a soft, dusty sigh, and every footstep echoes with the self-consciousness of someone tiptoeing through the memories of centuries. This was the world our protagonist inhabited every single day. A world carved from silence, wrapped in incense, and decorated with the kind of simplicity that feels almost sarcastic in its austerity. A world where candles behaved like minor saints, glowing dutifully, melting obediently, never questioning the purpose of their own slow annihilation. Well, except lately, since the recent mischief in the chapel, which had made the candles look suspiciously self-aware. The monastery sat at the edge of a valley too narrow for ambition and too wide for gossip, or so they liked to claim. In reality, monks are excellent at two things: praying and knowing everyone else's business. Still, it was the sort of place where the wind always sounded a bit judgmental, where prayer books smelled faintly of mold and regret, and where every object, from the wood of the pews to the iron of the bells, seemed to have accepted its fate centuries ago. Our protagonist, whose name we still withhold out of narrative teasing and a minor dramatic superiority, belonged to this world like a smudge belongs to parchment, almost invisible, but deeply, irremovably there. He was not the youngest monk, nor the oldest, nor the cleverest, nor the most devout. He prayed with a discipline that suggested habit more than passion, as though he feared that skipping a prayer might cause the universe to fall slightly off balance, but doubted anyone would notice either way. Every morning, before the sun had the decency to warm the earth, he woke with the resigned enthusiasm of someone who understands that holiness begins far too early in the day. He rose, stretched with monk-like understatement, and stepped into the corridor where shadows slept in the corners like lazy cats. He'd walk past the same ancient door hinges that groaned with the same theological discomfort, down the same narrow stairs carved by bare feet and bad posture. He'd breathe in the aroma of last night's incense, still clinging to the stone walls like an overly sentimental ghost. And as he lit his small oil lamp, he always felt the same tiny flicker of irony, that every morning began with the symbolic act of bringing light into darkness, even though his own faith was still hitting snooze. His fellow monks described him as quiet, which is monk speak for we're not entirely sure whether he's deeply pious or just tired. He had a face that always appeared to be halfway between contemplation and resignation, eyes that seemed to ask questions he never dared to say aloud, shoulders that carried the invisible weight of someone who had prayed more times than he had understood why. His tasks were simple in theory: keep the candles trimmed, copy manuscripts with the patience of a saint, and the handwriting of someone who had made peace with imperfection. Sweep dust from corners where dust returned out of sheer loyalty. Tend to the small herb garden that refused to grow anything except mint, as if mocking the monastery with its refusal to diversify. He moved through this routine like a man walking through a dream someone else had chosen for him. And yet, though he would never admit it out loud, he loved the quiet, loved the whisper of his quill on parchment, loved the soft glow of candles at dawn, loved the echo of footsteps in long corridors that made him feel less alone, even when it was only his own feet speaking back to him. He loved, too, the monastery library, which smelled of ancient paper, candle soot, and a faint but unmistakable scent of disappointment, as if every book remembered the many readers who had promised to understand them, and never quite managed it. He spent hours there, tracing his fingers along the spines of manuscripts older than some countries, reading prayers that had been whispered by mouths long returned to dust. But if his world seemed peaceful, serene, almost blessedly predictable, that was precisely the problem. Predictability, after all, kills curiosity long before doubt enters the room, and our protagonist, despite his outward obedience, had an inconvenient habit of thinking, not rebellious thinking. That would require energy. No, his thoughts were gentle, hesitant things, like shy children peeking from behind curtains, thoughts about why prayers sometimes felt more like messages sent to a celestial inbox that was permanently set to out of office, thoughts about why monks spent so much time talking to God and so little time listening, thoughts about why faith was always described as a gift, but felt suspiciously like a loan with unclear interest rates. He never spoke these thoughts aloud. That would require bravery he did not possess. But he carried them with him the way one carries small pebbles in a pocket. Light, harmless, but cumulatively inconvenient. His fellow monks liked him, mostly because he caused no trouble. He didn't question orders. He didn't forget chores. He didn't snore during silent prayers, a surprisingly rare virtue. He was what the monastery called steady, though what they really meant was quiet enough not to disrupt the illusion that everything here made perfect sense. But if you observed closely, if you watched the way his eyes lingered too long on the flicker of a candle flame, or how he paused to listen whenever silence grew too deep, as if expecting it to speak, you would sense it, that tiny, barely noticeable fracture in his certainty, a hairline crack, a soft, internal tremor, the earliest whisper of doubt, still unborn, but already stretching its shadow across the floor of his mind. For now, though, he lived as the monastery demanded, waking before dawn, praying with the sleepy sincerity of someone who hoped God wouldn't notice if his devotion occasionally drifted, working through endless tasks that felt less like sacred duties and more like cosmic housekeeping. And yet, even in this disciplined existence, humor, that uninvited guest of all human seriousness, slipped in like a sly breeze. For instance, every morning he listened to Brother Elias complain about how the bells rang too loud, too early, and entirely without compassion. If God wanted us awake this early, Elias grumbled, he would have created humans with natural alarm clocks. Brother Mateo, who was deaf in one ear, nodded sagely every time, convinced the complaint was a theological revelation. Then there was Brother Simon, who always tried to fast longer than everyone else, just to prove a point nobody cared about. The point varied depending on the week: spiritual strength, physical discipline, moral superiority. The result was always the same. By lunchtime, his stomach growled with such intensity that even the saints depicted on the stained glass windows seemed to flinch. And, of course, there were the novices, those enthusiastic, overly caffeinated creatures who prayed loudly, memorized too many psalms, and walked around with the zealous energy of candles that had just discovered fire. They tried too hard, smiled too wide, and bowed too low. The religious equivalent of stretching before a sprint in a marathon that would never end. Our protagonist watched them all with a quiet, affectionate irony, the kind that comes from recognizing your own past self in someone else's current efforts. He remembered, vaguely, what it felt like to be inspired, hopeful, fervent, though the memory had aged like wine left uncorked too long. Still there, but flat, dusty, and vaguely sour. He had once been fervent too, you see. Once believed that every prayer was heard, that every ritual mattered, that every silence was full of divine presence waiting to be revealed. But now he found himself praying more out of muscle memory than conviction. He whispered sacred words the way one recites a grocery list. He lit candles as though performing maintenance on the machinery of faith. He chanted hymns with the gentle detachment of someone who knows all the right notes, but no longer feels the music. And yet, and this is important, he wasn't faithless. Not yet. Not by any means. He simply drifted, like a leaf that still clings to the tree but sways in the wind a little too long, wondering what falling might feel like. But if drifting is quiet, the world was about to grow loud, because the monastery, with all its serene predictability and orderly dust, was a fragile ecosystem, one that depended on routine, obedience, and the comforting illusion that miracles behaved themselves. Lately, as you already know, they did not. And our protagonist, who had built his entire identity on doing everything properly, was the only one who seemed unable or unwilling to ignore it. He noticed when things felt off, when the silence thickened, when the wind carried whispers that seemed a little too articulate, when candles flickered even though the air was still, when the shadows in the corners stretched just a hair further than their natural reach, not dramatically, not frighteningly, just enough to suggest that the universe, bored with its own structure, had decided to improvise. He felt watched, but not in a threatening way, more like being observed by someone taking notes, someone evaluating, someone waiting for him. And though he didn't yet understand it, a strange truth hung over him like incense smoke, spiraling toward a ceiling carved with saints. The divine had noticed him. Perhaps by accident, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps because God, too, occasionally needed entertainment. But the church, the church, had not noticed him at all. Not yet. But soon they would, because the miracles they pretended not to see were inching closer, growing bolder, becoming harder to dismiss, harder to ignore, harder to hide behind polite denial and administrative paperwork. And our protagonist, humble as he was, quiet as he was, exhausted as he was, would become the unfortunate epicenter of it all. But for now, he simply walked the monastery halls, unaware that the ground beneath him was already beginning to shift, that the world he trusted was preparing to betray him, that faith, his old patient companion, was stretching, cracking, preparing to fall apart in the most poetic and inconvenient way possible. But we will get to that. For now, the candle still burns, the dust still rests, the silence still breathes its slow, ancient breath, and our protagonist still believes just enough to be dangerous. Before everything unraveled, before the doubts sharpened their little teeth, before the miracles stopped behaving like miracles and started behaving like pranks, before the church perfected the holy art of pretending not to see, our protagonist actually believed. Not in the loud way the novices did, with their booming psalms and over-enthusiastic amens. Not in the elaborate way theologians did, weaving arguments so complex even God would need a glossary to follow them. And certainly not in the transactional way some villagers believed, tossing quick prayers upward like coins into a cosmic fountain, hoping the divine would grant their wishes in exchange for minimal devotion. No, his belief was quieter, softer, like a candle that burned without fuss, without sermonizing, without insisting it was brighter than it actually was. He believed in the kind of miracles you never really see, only feel. The warmth of sunlight after a long winter, the rustle of leaves that sounded like whispered reassurance, the inexplicable comfort that sometimes settled over him during prayer, as if the universe had casually placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You're fine. Carry on." He believed in God, the way one believes in the reliability of morning, not because he understood it, but because it kept happening, even when he wasn't paying attention. His faith had once been a garden, carefully tended, lovingly watered, occasionally pruned with the delicate precision of someone terrified of cutting too much. He had planted his certainty like seeds, watching them sprout into gentle rituals and modest hopes. Nothing extravagant, nothing dramatic. Just a small, humble Eden inside his chest, tended by habit and held together by quiet longing. And oh, how he clung to it. He believed in miracles, though not the extravagant theatrical kind. Not the flaming sky, parted sea, levitating saint spectacles you read about in manuscripts written by men who likely exaggerated for dramatic effect. No, he believed in practical miracles, the kind that made life slightly less unbearable. A prayer answered with a faint sense of direction, a moment of peace that arrived just before panic, a feeling, subtle, half-formed, that someone, somewhere was listening. He believed in miracles the way one believes in discounts at the market, cautiously, skeptically, but with just enough hope to keep checking the shelves. He believed in angels, too, though he imagined them less as majestic winged beings and more like overburdened celestial clerks trying to keep track of far too many souls with far too little divine funding. He pictured them with ink-stained fingers, muttering under their breath as they sorted prayers into categories such as urgent, non-urgent, vague, and sent by mistake. He suspected most of his prayers belonged to the last category, and yet he prayed anyway, not because he felt holy, but because praying felt like brushing the dust off his soul. A daily maintenance ritual, a way to remind himself that he existed, that something bigger existed, that maybe, just maybe, someone was paying attention. He prayed in whispers, in sighs, in long stretches of silence that felt like confession without words. He prayed while sweeping floors, while copying manuscripts, while watching the light shift across the stone walls. Prayer seeped into his days like incense, subtle but persistent. But, and here lies the irony, even in his most devout years, his faith carried a strange twist, a suspicion, a gentle, polite doubt he never dared to articulate. He believed in God, but he was never entirely convinced that God believed in him. It wasn't insecurity, not exactly. More like a quiet awareness that the divine had far bigger concerns. Stars exploding, empires collapsing, people praying loudly about lost cows and minor fevers. Why would God bother with his small, unurgent life when he had never once demanded anything dramatic? He didn't pray for miracles. He didn't pray for visions. He didn't pray for signs. He prayed simply for clarity, for calm, for the strength to keep putting one foot in front of the other in a world that often felt like a test whose questions he had never been given. And for a long time, that was enough. His faith, like a well-worn robe, fit him comfortably, fraying at the edges, perhaps. Faded in color, certainly, but warm, familiar, and undeniably his. He believed in the old stories, too, not literally, not in the way the novice brothers did, but symbolically, the way a poet believes in metaphors. He loved the tale of Jonah, not because he thought a man could live inside a giant fish, but because he knew the feeling of being swallowed by something larger than himself. He loved the story of the burning bush because he understood how ordinary things could suddenly blaze with meaning when least expected. He loved the Psalms because they sounded like the ancient equivalent of midnight confessions whispered into darkness. Faith, to him, was a language. One he spoke imperfectly but tenderly. Before the doubt came, he even believed in the church, at least enough to trust its rhythms. He believed in the wisdom of rituals, the architecture of tradition, the comfort of belonging to something older than his own fleeting breath. He did not notice the contradictions then. Or perhaps he did notice them, but politely ignored them, the way one ignores the small cracks in a favorite cup, unwilling to admit it might someday break. He did not question why God seemed to speak more clearly to people who shouted, or why miracles always seemed to occur at politically convenient moments, or why the church spent so much time preaching humility while accumulating enough gold to blind a small village. He accepted these things with the soft resignation of someone who understands that every institution, divine or human, carries a certain amount of holy nonsense. And yet, despite all of this gentle belief, this quiet devotion, this poetic trust in the invisible, he had always felt something strange beneath the surface of his faith. A subtle trembling, a thin line of uncertainty stretched taut inside him like a thread waiting to snap, or unravel, or be pulled by a curious hand. He had the distinct, unshakable sense that something in the universe was slightly off. Not wrong, not malicious, just off. Like a book placed slightly crooked on a shelf. Like a candle burning a bit too brightly. Like a prayer that echoed a little too long. He didn't fear it. He didn't obsess over it. He simply carried it, the way one carries a faint tune stuck in the back of the mind. A suspicion that the world wasn't as polished as the church claimed, that the divine might be improvising, that miracles might be unsupervised, that faith might not be a staircase leading upward, but a labyrinth that grew new corridors whenever you least expected it. He kept these suspicions tucked deep within him, buried beneath layers of routine and reverence, hidden even from himself. But faith is a delicate thing. It can survive storms, but not secrets. And his faith, quiet, poetic, ironic in its sincerity, carried one secret too many. Because beneath his devotion, beneath his rituals, beneath his whispered prayers, lived a longing so deep it frightened him. He wanted to see something real, not metaphorical, not symbolic, not merely felt, seen. Just once he wanted the divine to step forward without disguise. Just once he wanted a moment that couldn't be explained away by theology or chance or wishful thinking. Just once he wanted the universe to break its silence and reveal itself plainly, unmistakably, undeniably. And that desire, that dangerous desire, is what makes a person vulnerable. The moment you ask the universe to show you something real, it begins rearranging things behind your back, quietly, patiently, with a kind of cosmic mischief. And when the answer finally comes, it never looks the way you imagined. It is never polite, never convenient, never gentle. It arrives tangled in irony, wrapped in confusion, dripping with meaning you didn't ask for. And his moment was coming. The thread inside him was already beginning to tremble. The divine, or something pretending to be divine, had heard his unspoken request. And it would respond not with a vision of glory, but with a series of strange, inconvenient, unsettling miracles the Church would pretend not to notice. And those miracles would undo him, gently at first, then profoundly, then beautifully. But that comes later. For now his faith still stands, fragile, earnest, unaware that it is moments away from being tested in the most inconvenient way imaginable. Doubt never arrives with fanfare. It doesn't storm through the doors of your mind wearing horns and a cape, announcing itself with the enthusiasm of a fallen angel who has read too many dramatic monologues. No, doubt prefers subtlety. It slips in quietly, politely, like a guest who insists they won't stay long, then moves a few chairs around when you're not looking. And, for our protagonist, doubt began with something so small, so absurdly insignificant, that he almost missed it entirely. It began with a dream. Not the kind of dream that makes you wake sweating and desperate for confession. Not the kind of dream that poets write about or prophets use as material for new holy calendars. No, it was a dream so mundane it felt suspicious, a dream so strange in its simplicity. It carried the unmistakable scent of divine mischief. He dreamed he was sweeping the monastery courtyard. Nothing unusual. He swept every day, sometimes twice when Brother Elias tracked in half the valley's dust. But in the dream, the broom swept on its own, gracefully, elegantly, without effort or irritation. It moved in perfect circles, leaving the stones spotless, glowing, almost polished. He stood there, doing nothing, watching the broom perform his work while the wind whispered, "See, this is why miracles aren't given to everyone." When he awoke, his hands tingled as if he had been holding something warm. The dream clung to him, not with fear, but with implication. Dreams were supposed to be symbolic, confusing, chaotic, not helpful. Helpful dreams were suspicious. Still, he dismissed it as the byproduct of too much incense and not enough sleep. Dreams were dreams. They meant nothing, unless you wanted them to mean something. And he didn't. He absolutely didn't. He repeated that to himself like a mantra as he swept the courtyard that morning, the broom feeling unusually eager, as if offended by his denial. But doubt, once planted, behaves like an invasive species. It grows roots fast. It germinates in silence. It spreads into places you thought were safe. A few days later, a second seed sprouted. It began during a conversation, if one could call it that, with Brother Ephraim, the oldest monk in the monastery, and the only one who seemed to have outlived even his own memories. Ephraim was known for speaking very little, seeing very much, and sleeping anywhere. He had been found napping in the tool shed, the bell tower, the confessional, and once, according to a story nobody dared confirm, inside the empty baptismal font. But that morning he was very much awake, sitting beneath the olive tree in the courtyard, staring at the sky as if trying to locate a thought he had misplaced somewhere near the clouds. Our protagonist approached him out of habit, offering a respectful bow. Ephraim didn't look away from the sky. "Strange weather," he murmured. The sky was perfectly clear. "Strange how?" the protagonist asked politely. Ephraim squinted. "The sun is too bright. It's been brighter lately, suspiciously bright. That's usually a sign." "A sign of what?" "A sign that something is about to malfunction." Our protagonist blinked. "Malfunction?" "Oh, yes," Ephraim said cheerfully. "The divine order malfunctions all the time. People don't notice because they prefer consistency over truth." There was a long silence. Then, as if he had not just casually accused the cosmos of poor maintenance, Ephraim yawned, stood up, and wandered away to find a new place to nap. The protagonist stared after him, unsettled. Ephraim said strange things often, yes, but this felt different, felt aimed, like an arrow fired lazily but with uncanny accuracy, like a thought that came not from a sleepy old man, but from something leaning through him. He tried to dismiss it, failed. The seed grew, and then came the third sign, not a dream, not a conversation, but an event, absurd, subtle, and perfectly tailored to unravel the threads of his certainty. It happened in the scriptorium. He had been copying a manuscript all morning, hunched over the desk with the posture of someone who had made peace with spinal discomfort. The text was an old prayer in a dialect so archaic even angels would need subtitles. His quill scratched across the page, slow but steady. Everything was ordinary until the ink changed color, not dramatically, not all at once, just gradually. The deep brown ink began shifting, darkening, then softening, then shimmering faintly as if catching invisible light. It became a muted gold, glowing lightly on the parchment. He froze. Ink was not supposed to glow, definitely not on weekdays. He leaned closer. The gold shimmer pulsed as if breathing. He blinked, thinking his tired eyes were deceiving him. But no, the text shone with a quiet, undeniable radiance. And then, just as he reached out to touch it, the glow faded. Completely, instantly, back to brown, back to normal, back to utterly unmiraculous. He sat there stunned. The room felt too quiet. The shadows looked too interested. Brother Matteo, working beside him, didn't notice anything. "Everything all right?" Matteo asked casually without looking up. "Yes," he said automatically. Because what else was he supposed to say? "I think the manuscript was whispering light at me. I think something divine is playing practical jokes. I think the universe is trying to get my attention but has terrible communication skills." No, thank you. He preferred sanity. Sanity was easier to pray with. But the moment he put down his quill, a tiny drop of ink, the same brown that had moments ago been glowing gold, shimmered for half a heartbeat before turning normal again. He inhaled sharply. Matteo raised a brow. "Allergies?" "Yes," the protagonist lied. "Allergies. But inside him another seed of doubt split open. That night he tried to pray. He knelt before the small wooden cross in his cell, lit a candle, and breathed in the heavy scent of melted wax. The flame flickered with unusual precision, as if listening closely. "Lord," he whispered, "I think something is happening. Or maybe nothing is happening. Or maybe I'm imagining everything." The candle flickered once, lightly, as if amused. He frowned. "I'm not asking for a sign." The flame tilted to the left. "I said I'm not asking for a sign." It tilted again. He stared at it, offended. "Stop that." The flame straightened. He pressed a hand to his forehead. "This is ridiculous." But the candle, traitor that it was, seemed to be laughing. Silently, he blew it out, deciding that spiritual clarity could wait until morning. The seeds of doubt had now taken root. But the universe, when it senses an opportunity to push someone toward enlightenment, or chaos, or both, does not stop at 3 signs. The 4th seed arrived in the form of a note. Not dramatic, not divine, just strange. It appeared tucked beneath his door at dawn. A small piece of parchment folded neatly. No name, no seal, no explanation. He hesitated before opening it. Secrets, he reasoned, were rarely helpful. But curiosity is louder than caution always. Inside, the note was a single sentence, written in handwriting he didn't recognize. Elegant, precise, unnervingly calm. Not every miracle is meant to be seen, but some insist. His breath caught. He read it again, and again. The handwriting looked almost familiar. Not from someone he knew, but from something he had once copied. Something ancient. Something from manuscripts that scholars attributed to divine messengers, or very bored monks with artistic penmanship. He slid the note under his mattress, as if hiding it would make it less real. But doubt isn't scared of mattresses. It spreads. Doubt became a quiet companion, walking beside him during chores, whispering questions through the silence, asking him things he didn't want to answer. Why the dream? Why the ink? Why the note? Why the shimmering? Why him? And the most dangerous question of all, what if the miracles weren't accidents? Because if they weren't, then someone or something was watching him, testing him, choosing him. And as everyone knows, being chosen by the divine is rarely good for one's mental stability. Then came the last seed, the one that forced his doubt into full bloom. It happened during evening prayers. The hall was dim. Candles flickered like tired saints. The monks knelt in rows, chanting the psalm in low, steady rhythm. The air was thick with devotion, incense, fatigue. And then he heard it. A whisper, not external, internal. A whisper that did not sound like his own thoughts. A voice, soft, amused, ancient, drifting through his mind like smoke. You wanted to see something real. He went rigid. The chant continued around him as though nothing had happened. The voice breathed again, gentle, patient. So watch carefully. He looked up. The cross above the altar seemed to pulse, once, like a heartbeat. Not dramatically, not brightly, just enough. Enough for him to know. Enough for him to understand. Something had begun. Something he had not asked for. Something he had secretly, foolishly desired. Doubt, that tiny, polite seed, burst into bloom, flooding him with questions he could no longer suppress. Was this divine? Was this madness? Was this cosmic coincidence? Was this spiritual mischief? Was this the answer to a prayer he never dared to voice? Or was this the beginning of the worst spiritual malfunction in monastery? History? He did not know. He only knew one thing. He was no longer alone inside his own faith. And whatever had entered wasn't leaving. Not yet. Crisis never begins with thunder. That is a common misunderstanding, usually propagated by poets, dramatists, and people who firmly believe their personal suffering deserves special effects. No, true spiritual crisis begins quietly. It arrives in the soft tread of disrupted routine, the mild tremble in familiar rituals, the sense that something in the universe is holding its breath and waiting for you to notice. For our protagonist, the fall did not begin with a shout, but with a silence that felt just a little too full. After the whisper during evening prayer, "Watch carefully," he could no longer pretend ignorance. Whatever subtle presence had brushed against his mind that night now hovered at the edge of his thoughts, like a shadow that had forgotten its proper place on the ground. He tried to continue with life as usual. Truly, he did. He woke at dawn, stumbled through half-conscious prayers, trimmed candles, swept floors, and copied manuscripts. But routine, once cracked, cannot return to its original shape. Even the smallest fracture changes everything. First came the rituals that began to fail in oddly specific ways. Take the morning bells. Brother Elias rang them every sunrise with the solemnity of someone announcing the apocalypse. But on the morning after the whisper, the bells refused to ring. Absolutely refused. Elias tugged the rope with both hands, then both arms, then with the desperate, full-body determination of a man wrestling invisible demons. Nothing. Not a single chime. The monks gathered below the tower, offering unhelpful suggestions. Try pulling harder. Try praying harder. Try pulling while praying harder. Elias glared at them all. Then, after 20 minutes of embarrassment, the bells suddenly rang on their own. 3 perfect harmonious notes that sounded nothing like their usual clanging complaint. Everyone froze. "Wind," someone muttered. "Birds," said another, less convincingly. "It happens," shrugged Brother Mateo. But our protagonist felt the whisper echo across his chest like a secret laugh. Watch carefully. He was watching, too closely, and the world was misbehaving in ways that felt increasingly personal. Next came the incense. During Vespers, the air should have been thick with the warm, spicy aroma of tradition, frankincense, myrrh, smoke that rises like the sigh of a tired saint. But that evening, when Brother Simon lit the incense, it refused to rise. It pooled low to the ground, swirling around their ankles like fog with mild social anxiety. The monks stared at it. Simon poked it with a stick. It refused to respond. "Perhaps it's symbolic," suggested one novice hopefully. "Of what?" someone asked. "Humility," he guessed. But humility does not normally smell like burnt raisins. The protagonist watched the smoke curl around his feet, moving with peculiar intention, like something searching, testing, sensing. He felt it touch his skin with a coldness that did not belong to smoke at all. And in that thin, unsettling moment, he understood a truth he did not want. The monastery was no longer obeying its own rules. The world around him was shifting, and he was the only one unable or unwilling to ignore it. Then came the worst moment of the week. Confession. He entered the confessional with the heavy dread of someone preparing to explain a cosmic misunderstanding. The wooden lattice smelled of varnish and embarrassment. He knelt, inhaled, and began. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," or thought about sinning, or perhaps observed something that might not technically be a sin but feel suspicious. A long silence. Then the confessor cleared his throat. "Elaborate, my son." Our protagonist swallowed. "I believe something unusual is happening." Another silence. Longer. He sensed Father Tomas adjusting his posture into the canonical position for dealing with nonsense. What kind of unusual? I fear that perhaps the divine is behaving strangely. A cough. Strangely. Yes, unpredictably. Tomas sighed loudly. My son, God is mysterious, not strange. Welcome to the semantic debate, he muttered, then immediately regretted it. In what way do you think things are strange? Tomas pressed. He tried to explain. The ink that shimmered, the candle that responded, the voice during evening prayer. But as he spoke, he could hear how absurd it sounded. He half expected the confessional to burst into flames just to spite him. Instead, Tomas spoke with the calm authority of a man who had heard far worse confessions and survived them. My son, doubt is natural. I'm not doubting, I'm observing. Observation is a gateway to doubt. Well, doubt is a gateway to thinking. Tomas's sigh echoed through the wooden panels. Thinking, my son, is not the goal. Then what is? Obedience. He nearly laughed, quietly, respectfully, irreverently. Obedience. The ultimate holy shield against curiosity. He left the confessional more confused than absolved. And that night, as he tried to sleep, the whisper returned. Not loud, not frightening, merely present. Obedience is for those who fear wonder. He sat upright in bed. No, 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 he whispered. Not again. Please stop. But the silence afterward felt smug. Then came the turning point, the moment when ambiguity became undeniable. It occurred during a simple task, refilling the holy water basin. He carried the bucket from the well, humming a hymn with the enthusiasm of someone pretending to be normal. He reached the entrance of the chapel and froze. The basin was already full. Overflowing, actually. Water spilled onto the floor in a slow, constant trickle. Crystal clear, perfectly still except for the exact edges where it spilled. He frowned. Brother Elias approached behind him, squinting at the puddle. "Did you fill it already?" our protagonist asked. "No." "Did anyone?" "No." They stared. The water, for reasons unknown and unrequested, rose higher. Elias tilted his head. Maybe it's blessed enthusiasm. The protagonist dipped his fingers into the water. It felt warm. Holy water was not supposed to feel warm. He pulled back quickly, and then, impossibly, the water level lowered to normal. Instantly, as if responding to him. Elias blinked. Did that just... "Please don't finish that sentence," the protagonist whispered. That evening, he went for a walk outside the monastery walls, something he rarely did, mostly because monks were discouraged from wandering into the world unsupervised. But he needed air, needed space, needed a sky that didn't look like it was watching him. The valley stretched quietly before him, the grass trembling in the breeze, like a congregation too nervous to admit they were listening. He inhaled deeply. "What do you want from me?" he whispered into the wind. The wind answered. Not with words, that would be too direct, but with a sudden shift, a sharp gust that carried dust, leaves, and the faint smell of incense. The same smell from the chapel. He felt a chill crawl down his spine. The world was following him. He closed his eyes. "I didn't ask for any of this." A soft sensation brushed his cheek, not wind. Something gentler, something deliberate. A whisper inside him exhaled. "You did ask." His breath caught. "No," he whispered, "I didn't." A pause. "You wanted something real." He pressed a hand to his chest, as if trying to hold himself together. "But not like this." The whisper did not answer. The valley stood silent. Behind him, the monastery bells began to ring without human hands. Slowly, deliberately. 1, 2, 3. He turned, gazed, and saw no one in the bell tower, no one at all. He felt the crack in his faith widen, not break, not yet, but weaken enough for the wind to slip through. From that night on, reality became unreliable. His prayers echoed unnaturally long, as if the darkness were repeating them. His shadow sometimes lagged behind him, refusing to obediently follow his steps. Books he had not touched appeared open to pages containing passages about divine confusion. Candles he lit would flicker in patterns that almost formed words. Incense would drift around him like a curious animal trying to determine whether or not he was edible. Every day brought new anomalies, small, subtle, perfectly calibrated to dismantle his sanity with the precision of a heavenly engineer. And worst of all, the other monks noticed nothing. They lived happily, blissfully, dangerously unaware inside their predictable little world, as if the miracles were choosing to reveal themselves only to him. He tried, once, to talk about it with Brother Matteo. "Do you ever feel like something is off lately?" he asked. Matteo shrugged. "Define off?" "As if the monastery is changing, or watching us." Matteo blinked. "Everything is always watching us. God, saints, each other. Even the garden gnomes the novices carved look judgmental." "This is different," Matteo laughed. "Perhaps you need rest." Rest. As if rest could fix the sensation that his soul had become a room with a door left ajar. He hardly slept anymore, and when he did, his dreams were a chaotic blend of symbolic nonsense and uncomfortably literal warnings. A door opening by itself, a candle refusing to die, a voice whispering through walls, a page turning in an empty room, a hand, gentle, unseen, brushing the air beside him, and always, always the same phrase: "Watch carefully." The crisis deepened. By the end of the week he could no longer distinguish between coincidence and message, between ritual and omen, between silence and speech, between the divine and the absurd. Faith, once a soft garden inside him, had become a labyrinth. Walls rising, paths shifting, shadows lengthening. He wandered through his days like a man caught in a holy joke he didn't understand. And somewhere, deep within, grew a terrible truth. He was afraid. Afraid of the divine. Afraid of his own mind. Afraid that the miracles were real. Afraid that the miracles were not. Afraid that the church would never believe him. Afraid that the church might. Afraid that he was being tested. Afraid that he was being punished. Afraid that he was being chosen. But above all, afraid that he was not meant to survive what came next. Because the crisis had only just begun, and the divine, or whatever pretended to be divine, had not yet shown its full hand. There comes a moment, quiet, unannounced, entirely unfair, when a person realizes that the ground beneath them has not been ground at all, but a polite illusion, a painted floor, a well-behaved dream. And once that realization cracks through the skin of your certainty, nothing holds still anymore. For our protagonist, that moment arrived not with thunder, nor visions, nor celestial music, but with the sound of pages turning themselves. It happened late at night, the hour when monks sleep heavily, the hour when candles burn with guilty intensity, the hour when the darkness grows sentimental and clings to the corners as if afraid of dawn. He had taken refuge in the monastery library, desperate for silence, though silence had recently become an unreliable companion. He sat at a table littered with manuscripts, his exhausted fingers tracing lines he had copied earlier in the week. He told himself he would read until his mind calmed, until the trembling inside him settled into something he could name. he told himself he would find clarity, or peace, or at the very least a distraction. He told himself many things. The universe disagreed. He noticed the sound first. A soft rustle, so slight it could have been a mouse, so delicate it could have been the whisper of old parchment adjusting to the cold. He ignored it, at first, but the rustle came again, louder, intentional. He lifted his gaze slowly. At the far end of the library, an old manuscript lay on its reading stand, untouched since morning. The flame of a nearby candle flickered once, twice, as if bracing itself. And then, with the calm confidence of something that had done this many times, the manuscript turned a page on its own. He froze. The page turned again. The silence in the room grew sharp, heavy, almost magnetic. He rose from his seat, legs trembling, breath lodged somewhere between disbelief and hysteria. He stepped closer. The old manuscript waited, still, peaceful, pretending innocence. Then another page turned, slowly, softly, purposefully. His heartbeat crashed through his ribs. His mind scrambled for explanations, wind, loose paper, trick of the light. But the universe had run out of excuses. There was no wind. The windows were closed. The manuscript's pages were thick, stiff, and had the flexibility of tree bark. Something was turning them. Something invisible. Something waiting. He whispered, "Stop!" The pages stilled immediately. Too immediately. He swallowed. Why me? No answer. Just the quiet flutter of candlelight reflecting off the ink. He stepped closer until he could see the text on the last turned page. His breath caught. It read, "When the seeker cannot walk, the path must move." His throat tightened. The script was old, ancient. A prayer about divine guidance. One he had copied dozens of times. He knew the text by heart. But this line did not belong to the prayer, not in this manuscript, not in any manuscript. He staggered backward, knocking into another reading table. Books toppled. The candle flame leapt high, then shrank, as if startled. He ran from the library, not walked, ran. His sandals slapped against the stone floor, echoing through the halls like accusations. The air seemed to thicken around him, as though the monastery itself were watching his escape with morbid curiosity. He reached his cell, slammed the door, and pressed his back against it, chest heaving. Silence, real silence. For the first time in days, the silence was not heavy or suspicious, not listening, not breathing, just still. He slid to the floor. "Enough," he whispered. "Please, enough." But the universe, with its impeccable timing, chose that exact moment to respond. A single sound, a knock, soft, gentle, at his door. He froze. Another knock, light, too polite. He stood slowly. His hand hovered over the latch. "Who's there?" he whispered. No answer. Just presence, breathing in the air itself, tangling with the shadows. A presence that felt ancient and curious and terribly, terribly patient. He opened the door. No one. The empty hallway, stretched before him, lit only by the trembling flame of a single candle mounted on the wall. The shadows gathered near the corners like monks gossiping in a hurry. He exhaled shakily and stepped out. Bad decision. The moment he crossed the threshold, the candle flame elongated, impossibly, stretching upward like a thin golden thread reaching for something far above. It grew taller, brighter, until it hummed with a subtle vibration. He stood, paralyzed. The flame whispered, audibly, impossibly, "Watch!" And then the flame snapped back into its normal shape, as if nothing had happened. He stumbled backward into his cell, slammed the door, and pressed his hands to his eyes. "No more," he whispered. "Please, no more." But crisis, once invited, does not leave. It makes itself comfortable. It rearranges the furniture of your soul. It knocks down walls you didn't know existed. And that night, it destroyed him gently. He tried to pray. He knelt before the wooden cross, shaking. His candlelight flickered nervously. His breath trembled. "Lord," he whispered, "I am losing myself." He waited for comfort. Instead, he felt something tug behind his ribs, as if an invisible hand had reached inside him and plucked a string that connected his heart to the world. His breath caught. His vision swayed. Then images. Not visions, not dreams. Images. Flashes. Of pages turning themselves. Of bells ringing without hands. Of candles stretching like living things. Of the basin overflowing with warm water. Of the whisper calling his name. Of shadows shifting with intention. Of the universe bending toward him. His knees buckled. He collapsed to the floor. He felt the room tilt. The air thickened into velvet. The silence pressed against him like the weight of an ocean. And then the voice. Not a whisper this time. A presence. Inside him, around him, above him, beneath him. "Do not fear the breaking." He whimpered. "I am afraid. Fear is the doorway. I don't want to go through any doorway." "But you knocked." "I didn't. You asked to see." He pressed his forehead to the ground. "I regret it." Silence. Then, frighteningly gentle. "Regret is the beginning of knowledge." He felt tears burn down his face. "I don't want knowledge," he whispered. "I want peace." The voice exhaled through him like wind through old ruins. "Peace is for after." And then the candle blew out. Sudden darkness. Complete. Consuming. He cried out and reached for the candle, for something, anything. But in that darkness he felt it. A hand, warm, human, resting on his shoulder. He froze. The hand squeezed gently. He whispered, "Who?" A breath brushed his ear. "Not yet." And then, light. A burst. His candle relit itself, by no hand. He sat on the floor, shaking violently, wild-eyed, breath shallow. The candle burned steady, tall, mocking him with its composure. His crisis, the quiet, unraveling of days, had transformed into collapse. His faith broke. Not violently, not dramatically. It cracked with soft inevitability, like old wax, like thin ice, like a whispered truth finally spoken. In that moment, kneeling in candlelight, he understood something dreadful. He could no longer control what he believed. Faith had become a creature with its own will, and the divine, or something wearing divinity like a borrowed cloak, was pulling him somewhere he did not want to go. He sobbed into his hands, because nothing is more spiritual than a complete failure of certainty, nothing more holy than crumbling, nothing more divine than being undone. And when he finally lifted his head, eyes swollen, throat raw, a final truth pierced him like a blade made of light. He was no longer seeking the divine. The divine was seeking him, and that, he realized with horrifying clarity, was the true beginning of his crisis, because being chosen is not a blessing. It is a burden, a summons, a dismantling, a calling you cannot refuse. The breaking point was not an ending. It was an opening, a doorway, and someone, was waiting on the other side. After a crisis, the world doesn't return to normal. It simply becomes quieter in new, uncomfortable ways, as if reality itself is catching its breath, trying to look innocent, pretending nothing happened, like a cat sitting beside a broken vase with an expression that says, "Gravity acts alone. I had nothing to do with it." For our protagonist, the days that followed his collapse felt unreal, not in the grand, visionary sense, No thunder, no heavenly choirs, no blazing revelations written in the sky. Just stillness. A strange, fragile stillness that wrapped itself around everything he touched. Silence clung to him like ash. The monastery corridors, once full of faint rustles and distant footsteps, now felt heavy and muffled, as though padded with invisible cloth. Candles burned without flicker. Shadows held their shape with suspicious discipline. Even the bells rang more softly, their chimes gentler, as if afraid to provoke whatever had unsettled him. No pages turned themselves. No ink glowed. No whispers followed him. No divine presence breathed through his bones. The absence was almost worse than the presence, because now he felt watched not by something active, but by something waiting. Those 3 days unfolded like a snow-covered landscape, deceptively quiet, deceptively clean, deceptively pure. Beneath the stillness, something cold and heavy simmered. He moved through the monastery like a ghost who hadn't realized he had died. The other monks noticed his pallor, his distracted gaze, the way he flinched whenever someone lit a candle. Brother Matteo, never delicate, asked bluntly, "Did you see a demon?" He blinked. "What?" "You look like you lost a theological debate with a demon, or your sleep, or your sanity." Matteo shrugged, which, frankly, is the same thing. He nearly laughed, a thin, brittle sound. "No demons," he said softly. "Only silence." Matteo patted his shoulder. "Silence is normal. It means God's busy." "Doing what?" "Planning, judging, delegating." Matteo lowered his voice. "He's basically a very old administrator." He left the conversation feeling worse. The silence inside him wasn't administrative silence. It was the kind of silence that follows a storm that hasn't finished yet. A silence with weight. A silence that listens. Then came the dreams. The first dream was simple. A blank page. Endless, white, without ink or texture. He stood on it, barefoot, weightless. Somewhere beyond the whiteness, a voice whispered, "You are not finished." He woke, trembling. The second dream was darker, a candle burning in the void, unmoving. He reached for it, and the flame leaned toward him like a curious animal. When it touched his fingertip, the flame whispered, "Not yet." He woke, gasping. The third dream was the worst. He stood inside the monastery, but everything was covered in dust, thick, pale, suffocating. Dust on the floor, dust on the walls, dust on the faces of statues, dust in the air, dust crawling along his skin like a memory decomposing. He tried to speak, but the dust filled his throat. The world crumbled gently around him. And when the dust settled, a silhouette stood in the doorway, not divine, not human, just waiting. He whispered, "What are you?" The silhouette whispered back, "You asked for truth." He woke, screaming. After the third dream, he stopped sleeping, or tried to. He lay awake on his straw mattress, watching the candlelight pulse against the ceiling. The silence pressed against the walls of his cell, turning each breath into a negotiation. He counted the hours by the slow drip of wax. By dawn, he felt hollow, as if his body remained, but his spirit had gone for a walk and forgotten to return. Despite exhaustion, he forced himself into routine. Routine was normal. Routine was safe. Routine was the fragile scaffolding that kept his sanity from collapsing entirely. But routine did not feel like routine anymore. When he swept, the broom bristles rasped against stone with a strangely musical rhythm, too rhythmic, too purposeful. When he prayed, the words felt weightless, dissolving before they left his mouth. When he walked the corridors, he felt the air shift just out of reach, as if stepping aside to let him pass. he felt removed, distanced, as if reality had been placed under glass. Even the monks seemed distant, their voices muffled, their footsteps far away, their faces slightly blurred, like a painting viewed through a veil. He wondered if they noticed. They didn't. That made it worse. Then, on the fourth day, something changed. He was in the courtyard, trimming the stubborn mint plants that refused to grow in any direction except the wrong ones. The sky above was clear, too clear. An empty stretch of blue that felt like an unfinished sentence. Brother Ephraim shuffled past him, muttering to himself about the nature of clouds. The protagonist barely looked up, until Ephraim stopped, turned, and stared. The old monk's eyes, usually vague and clouded with either age or boredom, sharpened with sudden, frightening clarity. "You," Ephraim whispered, pointing a trembling finger, "you've been touched." The protagonist froze. Touched by what? Ephraim stepped closer, scanning his face with unsettling intensity. By the Silent One. Cold spread through his limbs. Who? The Silent One, Ephraim repeated, voice trembling with equal parts fear and reverence. The one who comes before revelation, or ruin. It depends on the vessel. He swallowed hard. Am I a vessel? Ephraim tilted his head. You look cracked. The protagonist blinked. Cracked? Yes. Ephraim nodded sagely. But cracks let things in. Or out. Don't worry, though. Most vessels survive. Most, he whispered. Ephraim shrugged. Many. Pause. Some. And with that encouraging prophecy, the old monk wandered away toward the chapel, humming an off-key hymn about mercy. The protagonist sat very still, mint leaves trembling in his fingers. Silence pressed against his ears. A silence that felt like someone leaning close. A silence that felt like breath. He whispered, Are you still here? The wind stirred lazily in response. But that night, the true silence returned, not in sound, but in absence. During Compline, the final prayer of the day, he knelt with the others, chanting the old psalms with obedient monotony. The chapel candles burned steadily, their golden light warm against the stone. And then he felt it. A shift, like a weight lifting, like a door opening, like something loosening inside him, not painfully, but with the soft surrender of a knot untangling. For a moment, the silence enveloped him fully. It was not empty, it was vast. A silence so profound it felt like standing at the edge of creation. He inhaled sharply. The monks continued praying, unaware. The silence deepened, expanded, stretched around him like a cloak woven from breath and absence. For the first time it did not frighten him. It comforted him, gently, delicately, tenderly. Then, as quickly as it had come, the silence receded, like a tide pulling away from shore. The psalms rang out again. The candles flickered normally. Life snapped back into place. But something had shifted. He felt lighter, emptier, and yet, strangely, more anchored than before. He left the chapel in a daze. He walked the corridor with the softness of someone who had briefly stepped into another world and wasn't entirely sure he had fully returned. That night, as he lay on his mattress, candle extinguished, he whispered into the dark, What do you want from me? Silence answered. Not with words, not with visions, but with presence. A soft, steady presence that felt neither demanding nor cruel. A presence that felt like waiting snow, like dust settling, like a quiet door left ajar. And deep within him, deeper than fear, deeper than confusion, deeper than faith, something stirred. Not certainty, not understanding, something older, something humbling, something like surrender, not to the church, not to doctrine, not even to God in the way he had once understood God, but to whatever was unfolding inside him, whatever was listening, whatever was watching, whatever had chosen him, gently, inconveniently, irrevocably. And so, as he drifted into uneasy sleep, he understood a new truth. Silence is not the absence of the divine. Silence is the aftermath, the echo, the breath taken before the next word, the pause before the next miracle, the stillness before revelation, or ruin. He did not yet know which one awaited him, but the silence did. Revelations are rarely polite. They don't knock. They don't schedule appointments. They don't arrive with the courtesy of clarity or the decency of logic. No. Revelations prefer ambiguity. They like to appear crooked at the edges, shimmering between meaning and nonsense, the spiritual equivalent of a mirage seen by a very tired traveler who isn't sure if he's thirsty, inspired, or losing his mind. For our protagonist, the revelation, if one could dare call it that, began with something absurd. Hunger. Yes. Not prophecy, not vision, not divine thunder. Hunger. A hunger so sharp, so sudden, so unreasonable that he woke before dawn with the feeling that his stomach had decided to stage a protest. He rose from his straw mattress, pressing a hand to his abdomen as if trying to negotiate with it. "Not now," he whispered. "Please, now is not the time." His stomach growled in holy defiance. The monastery was still asleep, candles unlit, corridors dark. Shadows curled like animals hibernating against the stone. Even the dust felt too tired to float. He slipped quietly into the hallway, moving with the cautious guilt of someone committing a minor sin, which, technically, he was. Eating before morning prayer was frowned upon, theologically suspicious, and possibly punishable by Brother Matteo lecturing him about fasting with the enthusiasm of a man convinced that God kept score. But hunger is its own morality. He made his way toward the kitchen. It was cold, very cold, colder than the hallways, colder than the chapel, colder than the night air outside, unnaturally cold. He hesitated. "Is someone there?" No answer. He stepped inside and froze. The room was bathed in a pale, ghostly glow. Not candlelight, no flame danced, not moonlight. The windows were shuttered, not morning light. Dawn was still far away. A soft luminescence spilled across the wooden table, as though the air itself had decided to shine. And on that table, bread. A single piece of bread. Warm, fresh. Steam rising gently from it like a prayer ascending from a tired throat. He stared at it. "Absolutely not," he whispered. His hunger disagreed. Loudly, the room remained silent. The glow grew slightly brighter, then dimmer, pulsing with subtle intention. He approached slowly, every step loud in the hollow stillness. He reached out a trembling hand toward the bread. "Don't," he whispered to himself. He touched it anyway. It was warm. Too warm. Freshly made. But no one had baked anything that night. The ovens were cold. The flour stores untouched. The kitchen empty except for that impossible loaf. He pulled his hand back as if burned. "This is a sign," he whispered, "or a trap, or a test, or insanity in snack form." The bread did not respond, but something else did. A soft whisper, not external, not internal, but ambient, as though the air had learned to murmur. "Eat!" He stumbled backward. "No, absolutely not. That's how stories start. People eat mysterious things and then wake up inside whales or become prophets or lose their sense of normalcy entirely. Eat. I'm fasting. You are starving." He swallowed hard. "That's irrelevant." His stomach roared again, like a theological lion demanding obedience. He sat on a stool, head in his hands. Was he hallucinating? Was he dreaming? Was he being tempted, tested, mocked, nourished by the divine, targeted by something pretending to be divine? Was this a sacred offering or cosmic mischief? He did not know. He wished he cared less. Finally, reluctantly, he tore a small piece from the warm loaf. He raised it to his lips, paused. "Please," he whispered to no one, "let this be normal bread." He ate it. Warm, soft, simple. Bread, just bread. He sighed with shaky relief, but then a warmth spread through his chest. Not painful, not unnatural, just spreading, slowly, like someone pouring sunlight into his ribs, filling him from within. A heat that reached his fingertips, his throat, his eyes. He gasped. A soft glow filled his vision, not overwhelming, not blinding, just present. Around the edges of the kitchen, around the edges of his breath, around the edges of himself. He blinked and saw something, not with his eyes, but behind them. At first, it was only light, soft, pulsing, like the echo of a heartbeat that wasn't his. Then shape, a silhouette, human, maybe, not entirely, a figure made of suggestion rather than flesh. Light woven into hints of limbs and contours, like a shadow cast by a flame that wasn't there. He tried to speak, but his voice stuck in his throat. The figure moved, not walking, but simply shifting into new existence. Then it raised a hand, not threateningly, not solemnly, not reverently, just raised it, as one does when greeting a frightened animal. He trembled. "What are you?" he whispered. The figure did not answer. Its form flickered subtly, as if undecided about how literal it wished to be. He swallowed hard. "Are you divine?" Silence. "Are you an angel?" Silence. "A hallucination?" Silence. "Bread-induced nonsense?" Silence. His breath shook. The figure lowered its head slightly, as if considering him. Its outline grew sharper, then softened again, like something made of memory rather than matter. And then, finally, a sound. A voice, quiet and resonant and impossibly layered, as though made of several voices overlapping in gentle disagreement. "You asked." He froze. "For what? Truth?" "I didn't. You did." He shook his head. "I asked to see something real. Real is not what you think. Am I dreaming?" The figure paused, then responded with what sounded suspiciously like a sigh. "If you were dreaming, you would understand more." He blinked. "That's not reassuring." The figure tilted its head, not in threat, in patience. "You wanted to see. I regret that now. Regret is a door. You keep saying that. You keep needing it." He felt tears rise, frustration, fear, exhaustion, awe, hunger, everything tangled into one unbearable knot. "Why me?" he whispered. The figure did not move, but the light around it pulsed. Once, twice. A breath. "Because you listen." His eyes burned. "I don't want more signs." "You will not receive signs," he blinked, "but you will receive what you seek." "I'm not seeking anything. You are." "What?" The figure leaned closer, or perhaps the light did, and the air thickened with meaning he could not decipher. "You want the world to make sense." His breath caught. Because yes, beneath everything, beneath faith and fear and routine and doubt, that was the truth. "I don't want that anymore." Wanting does not cease existence. His knees weakened. He gripped the table for balance. "What happens now?" he whispered. The figure paused. The light pulsed again, softer than before, almost weary. "Now, nothing. No, please, no more riddles. There will be quiet." "Quiet," he repeated. Yes. For how long? The figure flickered like a candle in a draught. As long as you can bear it. Then, gently, heartbreakingly, the figure dimmed. The edges blurred, the light thinned, the silence thickened, and before he could ask anything more, it was gone, just gone. The kitchen returned to its normal shape, cold, still, empty. The glow vanished, the warmth vanished. The air became ordinary again, infuriatingly ordinary. The bread remained, but it was cold now, just bread. He stared at it for a long time. Then he whispered, "Was that real?" No answer. He sighed, burying his head in his hands. It could have been divine intervention, or exhaustion, or mental collapse, or hunger-induced hallucination, or all of them at once. He did not know. He suspected he would never know. Revelations, after all, are rarely revelations. They are questions wearing the costumes of answers. He rose, trembling, and left the kitchen. As he stepped into the hallway, a faint breeze brushed his cheek, though no window was open, no door ajar. A whisper drifted through the air, so soft he wasn't sure if it was sound or memory. Listen. And he understood, painfully, reluctantly, that the revelation had not been what he saw. It had been what he didn't. The ambiguity itself was the message, the uncertainty, the teacher, the silence, the guide. And the truth, whatever it was, would not shout. It would wait. It would whisper. It would unfold slowly, painfully, inconveniently, in the days to come. He walked back to his cell, feeling both emptied and filled, wounded and comforted, lost and guided. He knew nothing. And for the first time he understood that this was its own kind of revelation. There's a peculiar hour of the night, too late to be yesterday, too early to be tomorrow, when the world feels like it has forgotten itself. The air grows thin, thoughts become transparent. Time loses its usual enthusiasm for linearity, and drifts around like a monk who has wandered into the wrong prayer session, but is too polite to leave. It was during that hour that our protagonist finally understood he was no longer living inside certainty. He was living inside after the crisis, after the silence, after the ambiguous revelation in the kitchen, after the question that kept pressing at the inside of his ribs, what happens now? He did not know, but he sensed, in the quiet, in the corners, in the trembling of candles, that something was shifting, not dramatically, not dangerously, just truthfully. And truth, as everyone knows, is rarely comfortable. He woke that night, or perhaps morning, feeling watched. Not in the intrusive, predatory way one fears in dark hallways, but in the contemplative way a painter watches a blank canvas, wondering what form might emerge. He sat up slowly. His cell was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the ember dying at the wick of his candle. The air was cool, still, heavy with expectation. He whispered into the quiet, "Are you there?" No voice answered, but the silence leaned, which was worse. He rose, wrapped his robe around himself, and stepped outside into the corridor. His footsteps echoed softly, the sound absorbed by the thick stone walls that had listened to centuries of whispered prayers and unspoken doubts. The torches along the walls crackled gently, throwing shifting shadows across the ground. He walked without aim, the most honest form of pilgrimage. The monastery felt different that night. The corridors seemed longer, stretching like thoughts that refused to end. The air felt thinner, like breath leaving a mouth after a confession. Even the dust floating in the candlelight seemed to glow with a quiet understanding. He found himself in the cloister garden. The moon hung low, pale and heavy, like a tired lantern strung up by a negligent angel. The herbs rustled in the faint breeze, mint, rosemary, sage, a holy mixture of comfort and bitterness. He walked to the old olive tree. Its branches spread wide, ancient and crooked, like a hand reaching out to the world with equal parts wisdom and arthritis. He sat beneath it and exhaled. For a long moment he said nothing, thought nothing, felt nothing. Then the thoughts returned, slow, hesitant, as though they were checking whether it was safe. He whispered, "What am I supposed to do now?" The wind stirred, a gentle, indecisive breeze. He closed his eyes. I saw something, or thought I did. Or maybe nothing was real. Maybe everything was real. Maybe everything in between was real. The breeze shifted, brushing his cheek like an absent-minded blessing. "I want to understand," he continued, "but understanding feels impossible, and not understanding feels unbearable." A leaf fell. He took that as a response. He wasn't sure if it was. He continued anyway, because loneliness makes confession easy. "I feel like a door has been opened inside me, and I don't know if I should step through it or close it." He paused. "I don't know what the divine wants from me. I don't know what I want from the divine. I don't even know what divine means anymore." Moonlight spilled across the courtyard like a slow exhale. His voice softened. "And I'm afraid." Another pause, a longer one. "I'm afraid I'm being called, and I'm afraid I'm not." He thought he heard something then, a soft rustle, a shift in the air, a presence bending slightly closer. Not a figure, not a voice, not a certainty, just attention. Someone, or something, listening. He swallowed. "If you're there, just tell me. Do I follow this? Do I ignore it? Am I meant to understand anything at all?" The wind died. The leaves stilled. Silence. The kind that feels like someone thinking before speaking. Then a single olive dropped from the branch above, landed softly beside his foot. He stared at it. "Is that an answer?" Silence. He waited. The olive did not glow or vibrate or levitate. It did nothing except exist, which, in its own way, was more unsettling than any miracle. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I really don't know what any of this means." The olive remained unhelpfully olive-like, and yet something in its simple presence soothed him, a reminder that not every sign has to be dramatic. Not every truth has to be overwhelming. Some revelations arrive in the form of ordinary objects doing absolutely nothing special. Maybe meaning wasn't in the miracle. Maybe meaning was in the confusion. He didn't know. He suspected he wasn't meant to know. A soft crunch made him turn. Brother Ephraim emerged from behind a pillar, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His robe was wrinkled. His hair was chaos. His expression was serene, the expression of a man who had long since made peace with not understanding anything. "Couldn't sleep?" Ephraim asked. The protagonist shook his head. "No." Ephraim nodded, unimpressed. "Good. Means you're awake." "That's tautological," he said. "Yes," Ephraim said proudly. "Truth often is." The old monk sat beside him, joints cracking loudly in the otherwise profound silence. They both stared at the olive for a long time. Finally, the protagonist spoke. "Ephraim, what do you think God wants?" The old monk scratched his beard. "Depends on the day." "From me? Ah." Ephraim chuckled. "That's different." "Different how?" "You care." The protagonist blinked. "Everyone cares." "No," Ephraim said gently. "Everyone fears. You care." He didn't know how to respond to that, so he didn't. Ephraim leaned back against the trunk. Let me give you advice." He nodded, hopeful. "Whatever is happening to you, don't expect sense. Sense is a human invention. The divine isn't limited to it. That's not comforting." "It shouldn't be," Ephraim said with a grin. "Comfort leads to stagnation. What should I do, then?" Ephraim shrugged. "Walk, listen, eat, pray, doubt, dream, repeat. Revelation isn't a destination. It's a hobby. A hobby. Yes, a hobby, like gardening. But instead of plants, you cultivate confusion." He rubbed his temples. "You're really not helping." Ephraim laughed softly. "Good. If I helped, you'd stop searching." They sat in silence again. The protagonist looked up at the sky, feeling the enormity of everything pressing down on him and yet, strangely, not crushing him. A soft thought, unexpected, gentle, rose in his chest. Maybe the point isn't to know. Maybe the point is to live the question. He exhaled, long and slow. "Ephraim, do you think God is avoiding me?" The old monk shrugged cheerfully. "Maybe. Maybe he's busy. Maybe he's embarrassed. Maybe he knows you're not ready. Maybe he is ready, but you're not. Maybe he's standing right behind you pretending he isn't. That's horrifying." "Yes," Ephraim agreed. "Isn't it wonderful?" The protagonist, despite himself, laughed. A small laugh, a tired laugh, but genuine. Later, when he returned to his cell, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Space. Inside him. Space where certainty had once suffocated him. Space where confusion could breathe freely. Space where whatever was coming next could unfold at its own strange, inconvenient pace. He lay down, closed his eyes, took a breath. He did not ask for signs. He did not plead for clarity. He did not beg for understanding. He simply whispered, "I'm listening." No voice answered. But somewhere, deep in the stillness, he sensed the faintest ripple, a presence shifting. Perhaps divine, perhaps imagined, perhaps something between those two. It didn't matter. A doorway had opened. A journey had begun. And the ending, whatever it was, would remain unwritten, unspoken, unruled, for now, because perhaps God was busy, or shy, or amused, or avoiding messages like everyone does on Mondays. Whatever the reason, the silence that followed felt neither empty nor cruel. It felt patient. And for the first time he realized he could live with that. Night settled over the monastery like an old velvet cloak, heavy, soft, and frayed at the edges where countless prayers had worn it thin. The final candle in the corridor flickered with the tired dignity of a monk who had survived too many vigils, its flame leaning this way and that, as if whispering a last secret to the shadows before surrendering to sleep. Our protagonist sat alone in his cell, though alone no longer meant what it once did. The air around him felt different now, not crowded, not haunted, just quietly inhabited. As if some presence had pulled up a stool beside him, folded its hands, and settled in for the long, patient act of watching a human become whatever comes after bewilderment. He exhaled softly, the kind of exhale that only arrives after a long and rather inconvenient enlightenment. The straw mattress beneath him rustled gently, offering no advice. The little wooden cross on the wall stared back with infinite neutrality. The same carved expression it had always worn, as if to say, "You are not the first to be confused, and you certainly won't be the last." The candle beside him trembled. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on his knees, letting his fingers press gently against his temples. The warmth from the flame brushed his face, drawing faint gold across the hollows beneath his eyes. He whispered into the dimness, "So this is where I am now." Not a question, not a statement, just a small acknowledgement, a point on an invisible map, a pause between two breaths. He waited for the whisper, the one that had haunted him, guided him, taunted him, comforted him. Nothing. He waited longer. Still nothing. The silence pressed around him gently, like a cool cloth laid across a fevered brow. But this silence was no longer an enemy. It had become a companion, a teacher, a mirror. He lifted the candle, studying its flame as if it were a living thing. In a way, it was. The flame swayed in the draught, bowing slightly, rising again. A tiny universe contained in trembling light, a symbol of everything that had changed, and everything that stubbornly refused to. He whispered, "I don't understand, but maybe I don't have to." The flame flickered once, as if in delicate applause. Outside, the wind sighed against the stone walls, tired, old, familiar. The monastery slept restlessly, as monasteries often do after one of their residents has had an existential crisis capable of unsettling even the saints carved into the beams. Somewhere down the hall, Brother Matteo snored with enthusiastic nasal conviction. A door creaked as the night expanded and contracted like the lungs of a dreaming giant. Dust settled softly onto the floor, forgiving everything it touched. He let his eyes close for a moment. Inside him, something had loosened. The tight knot of certainty, the rigid frame of ritual, the old scaffolding of what faith should be. Now there was space, an inner clearing, a quiet field where questions could rest without demanding answers. He breathed in, held the air, released it, and in that simple act he realized his crisis had not ended, his understanding had not arrived, his revelation had not resolved itself, and yet he was at peace, a strange, delicate peace, the kind that forms not from clarity, but from surrender, not from answers, but from acceptance, not from divine revelation, but from the willingness to keep listening even when the heavens refuse to speak. The candle leaned again, its flame tracing a slow arc in the dim room. He whispered, "Whatever comes next, I'm here." Soft footsteps brushed the hall. Perhaps a monk, perhaps something else. He did not rise to check. He no longer needed to know everything. Curiosity, he realized, could live comfortably alongside uncertainty if one stopped confusing it with fear. He set the candle back on the table, watched the flame breathe, let the quiet settle. In the distance, a lone bell chimed, not the urgent clang of morning prayer, but a soft, accidental note. A bell nudged by a draught, perhaps, or a clumsy angel, or a moment of grace disguised as coincidence. He smiled, a tired, gentle smile. He whispered one final sentence into the candlelight, not a prayer, not a plea, but a simple, human truth. "I'm listening." The candle answered with silence. The night answered with stillness. And the universe, mischievous, divine, indifferent, compassionate, or all of the above, answered with the faintest shift of air, as if leaning closer, amused, patient, waiting for him, waiting with him, waiting through him, and as the flame quivered, and steadied, and rose again, the story too lingered at its threshold, not ended, not concluded, not sealed, just paused, suspended in that holy, irritating, beautiful ambiguity where faith and doubt hold hands and pretend not to, a last breath of warmth, a last shimmer of gold, a last whisper of possibility folded into the quiet. And with that, the candle's flame stretched one final time, a thin, beckoning gesture, before shrinking into its soft, steady glow. The room dimmed, the shadows exhaled, the story rested, and then, in a tone half poetic, half ironic, entirely itself the narrator's voice, my voice, drifted through the silence like a final candlelit joke. If this story kept you awake a little longer tonight, subscribe to Religious Night Stories, where faith never sleeps, even if you do.